Alright, I got my mock-up fabric ready. This is gonna be the most disgusting looking mock-up. But like, we out here, boys! So after much contemplation, this is the plan. So I'm gonna take this onesie pattern. Actually, I was gonna do like a bunny suit pattern mixed with like a shirt pattern mixed with a puff sleeve pattern, but that would have been really bad. I found this pattern and I was like, aha, this is perfect. So the first thing is that it has all the components that we need. So first of all, it's not form-fitting because I don't want this to be form-fitting. So this pattern, which is really great, is that it splits in two, and that's exactly what we want, because one side is going to be one color, the other side is going to be the other color. So the fact that it's a split pattern is awesome. What I'm going to do, basically make a onesie without the sleeves, and then I'm going to alter it so that it like goes into a V cut, and then I'm going to improvise some bloomers somehow. I have made them before, but it's been a hot minute, so pray for me. And then I'm going to use this puff sleeve pattern that I have and just make it like really, really big. I am starting with a mock-up. Like, I was feeling really unconfident until I found this pattern, but I still think I should do a mock-up just because I am considering sequined material just to be super extra and shiny. Sparkly, not shiny. And that's gonna be really expensive and we don't want to waste material, and I have this stuff that's never gonna get used for anything. So yeah, so we're just gonna have a nice little mock-up adventure today, and yeah. Alright, let's go. Hi, buddy! So I actually don't usually do mock-ups. I've only done a mock-up one other time in my life, and that was like 10 years ago. So it's been a hot minute, but I feel like if I didn't do a mock-up for this cosplay, I would simply die. I made sure to use a basting stitch, which basically means making the stitch length as wide as possible, so that will be easier to seam rip it later on, because that's what we're going to do to get our final pattern. I made sure to label all the different pieces so that I wouldn't get confused. And then I went ahead and altered the bottom half of the onesie to take the legs away, so that would be a V cut. And then I decided to work on the sleeves. For the sleeve, in this footage, you can see I'm cutting it out the exact same dimensions as the actual sleeve pattern. But later, if we want to do some future footage, I actually went back in and cut the sleeve out much bigger to make it like poofier, because I wasn't happy with how big the original sleeve was. So just keep that in mind. I definitely recommend if you're using a similar sized sleeve pattern, that was so many S's, oh my gosh, to make it much bigger, because her sleeves are very poofy. And then here's a little rundown in case you don't know how to do puff sleeves. So I went ahead and baste stitched the bottom and top of the sleeve, and then gathered both sides. Then I pinned the bottom side to the sleeve cuff and went ahead and sewed that in. Then you just sew up the side of the sleeve and set that into the actual armholes. Then I worked on the bloomers. So I took this pattern for a pair of like jammy pants, and I'll put a picture of the actual pattern up on screen. This is the pattern that I used. And then basically just made the pattern wider so I could gather the pieces into a nice pair of bloomers. Sew that all together. Sewed a channel for the elastic band up at the top, and then add the elastic band using the safety pin trick. And then the next part I don't have footage for because I was having a manic episode and just it slipped my mind apparently. But I gathered the bottom of the shorts and sewed those to some cuffs to make the final bloomers. Here's a picture of what the mock-up looked like at the end of the night. Don't ask why those are two different sizes. It was a rough night. I was having a manic episode, and then I got literally diagnosed with bipolar disorder the next day. So like we were having a time. But anyway, the mock-up was done and I could finally get my actual materials. So the next day I went over to my favorite fabric store. I initially wanted to get some sequins, but they are also $40 a meter, so that was not gonna happen. Right across from the sequins though, they had this really nice blue velvet, which was only $10 a meter. And then they had a matching red one, which was twice as much for some reason, which isn't ideal. Another option was this shimmery material, but again, it was incredibly incredibly expensive, so we weren't gonna do that. This other material was pretty nice. So I ended up going with the 2 velvets and some sequins for the yellow parts. So that way I would only need 1 meter. So I scooped those up and it was finally time to get sewing. The first thing I worked on was the bodysuit. So I began by disassembling my mock-up and using the resulting pieces as pattern pieces for my final material. So I cut all of those out, sewed them together. For the sleeves, I had to add the stripes. Since the blue material was cheaper, I decided to use that as the base and then just sewed the red on top because the red was more expensive. If you're wondering about the actual measurements, the unsewn strips of fabric were 15 centimeters and then the final stripes were around 6 centimeters. I pinned those onto the sleeves and then sewed them on. This was a very long and very arduous process. Then I cut the sleeve cuffs out of the sequins. For the gathering, I actually hand gathered everything because I tried doing it on the machine, but since the sleeves were so thick with all the different layers, you know, with the stripes and everything, I actually couldn't get them to gather using the machine stitching, so I just did that by hand and then did the rest of it as I did with the mock-up. The last thing I did was I actually stuffed the sleeve bands to make them more cartoony, just to add to the aesthetic. I thought that would be a nice touch. And then I went ahead and finished sewing the sleeves into the bodysuit. Next, I made some really big piping. That's essentially what this is. So I took the sequin material, I sewed it wrong sides together. Usually you do it right sides together, but this time I did it wrong sides together with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and then stuffed that, sewed that to the, I guess we want to call it the crotch of the bodysuit. Before that, I folded the crotch seam under and sewed it down, and then I took the seam allowance of the piping and sewed that to the finished edge of the V cut of the bodysuit. Hopefully that makes sense. So I moved on to the collar. On the collar, I did really, really badly. So I'm actually not going to dwell too much on it because I don't feel comfortable giving advice on the collar because the collar looked like a hot mess. So just here's some footage, but don't take my advice. I got the collar done, but at what cost? It does not look good, but oh well. Next I worked on the pom-poms, so I cut out some circles, sewed them together, right sides together, while leaving an opening, turned them inside out, added some stuffing, and then sewed up the opening by hand, sew them to the front of the costume, and the bodysuit is all done. Next, we're moving on to the bloomers. So for this, again, I took apart my mock-up to get all the different pattern pieces. What it ended up boiling down to is actually one pattern piece that I was able to use 4 different times. So you actually don't need like a separate front and back piece. I learned like the front and back can just be the same piece. So I just took this piece and cut it out. But as you can see, I'm cutting it out much wider than the actual pattern piece because again, I want the bloomers to be bigger than I had initially made them. So I just took the liberty of just making them really, really flippin' wide, which, you know what, you can't go wrong. They're supposed to be nice and poofy, so you can just kind of go wild with this. I repeated the same stripe process on the bloomers, which again was a pain in the ass, but here we are. Sewed that all down, which again was a pain in the ass, but you know, we're doing it for our favorite existential jester girly. We got to do it. We got to show our appreciation. She's so sad. Me too, bitch. Depressed besties. I'm sad too. Yay, mental illness. Anyway, so I finished all those pieces and then I went ahead and sewed the bloomers together. Then I did the same kind of piping process that I did for the bodysuit to make the cuffs of the bloomers. So I sewed the sequins, added some stuffing, and then sewed that strip together to make a big donut. Delicious. And then I gathered the bloomers by hand again because doing it on the machine doesn't really work. And I pinned those to the donut, sewed it to the donut, struggled a lot with that, had a lot of fun sewing those sequins, and that is it for the bloomers. So the next thing I worked on was the hat. So I took a toque that I already had and used that kind of as a base. The first thing though that I had to do was measure my head with a wig on. Very important that you put a wig on and then measure the circumference of your head, because obviously it's going to be different from when you're not wearing a wig. So I took that measurement and made sure that the bottom of the hat was going to match the measurement of my head with the wig. So I have no idea how to actually pattern out a jester hat, but I just kind of went for it. So this is the shape that I went for. Cut that out and then sewed it and tried it on. Here was the verdict. I was so close. All right, we're gonna... So, what needs to happen is these just need to fan out a little bit more so that they like, yeah, go wider. But aside from that, we're on the right track. So with that information, I just revised the pattern, made sure that the ends of the hat were flared out a little bit more. So once I was happy with the pattern, I then cut it up into different pieces. It actually boiled down to 2 different pieces. And this was so that I could have different pattern pieces for each of the different colored pieces of the hat. So one really important thing is that part of the pattern had seam allowance, part of it didn't. So I had to add seam allowance to the part that didn't. As you can see, I'm doing that here. So I went ahead and cut out all of the different pattern pieces and pinned them together. And finally, I ended up with this. Then I sewed everything together. And then I added the yellow piping the same way that I did on the shorts. And then finally I made some pom-poms the same way I did the other ones for the bodysuit. Sewed that onto the ends of the hat, and here's a look at the finished hat. I was very happy with it and felt very accomplished because this process was very brain-breaking, but I managed to do it anyway, so we're very proud about that. Next, I worked on the gloves, so I cut them out using this pattern from Yaya Han. This is my go-to glove pattern. It works really well. And I sewed them using a stretch stitch, which is this setting here. And then I made some more piping and sewed them to the wrists of the gloves. This was very challenging, but you know, we made it through. And this is what the final gloves look like. Then I worked on the arm socks or undershirt or whatever you'd like to call it. It's technically not arm socks because it's not made of tights, but either way, I used this quick sew pattern and just cut it in half basically. So I only cut out the top half of the leotard. I used a zigzag stitch for this so that it would stretch, and then I add some elastic bands to the thumbs so that they can stretch like over your thumb, and it will keep the shirt from like pulling back on your wrists. Next, I worked on the shoes. So I decided to use this old pair of work shoes that I have as the base. So I just traced around them really generously to get the general shape. Cut 2 of that pattern out and sewed it together with a stretch stitch. Then add some elastic bands to the bottom to keep them stretched over the shoes. And this is what that looked like when it was all done. I once again made another piping donut, piping hot donut, except it's not piping hot, it's just piping. Anyway, and I hand stitched those to the ankles of the shoe covers, and this is what they look like in the end. And that's it for this cosplay. So without any further ado, let's get to the final reveal. Okay, hello. Welcome to the wrap-up thoughts portion of the video. As you can see, I am not on camera because I am exhausted from a long day of work and I look gross and I don't feel like putting on makeup and getting myself sat down for an outro. So we're just gonna do the outro with this lovely animated panda. My wrap-up thoughts on this cosplay. So the first thing that I want to say for all of you wanting to do this cosplay is to first and foremost be very patient, because this cosplay takes so much patience. Whether it's sewing all the stripes, whether it's hand gathering the fabric because you've sewn the stripes, whether it's making the hat in all its various different pieces. That was a really long and arduous process. Like, there's a lot about this cosplay that demands patience. So it's really important to kind of pace yourself and be prepared to like do a lot of really like repetitive and intricate work. So that's the biggest thing that I want to say to people wanting to do this cosplay. How do I feel about the cosplay that I made? Honestly, I am not 100% on it. I think the top half looks great. I think the bottom half looks awful. I don't know if that's just like because of how I made it. I don't know if that's just because of the design, like just that the design is just naturally gonna look a little bit weird, or if I'm feeling body conscious, or maybe a combination of all three. The mock-up, it all looked really good, so I didn't have any issues with the mock-up, but then when I think because the final material that I used had stretch and the mock-up material did not have stretch, and then that paired with the fact that I put this really heavy piping on it, I think that changed the structure of the costume in a way that I was not prepared for. So if you're gonna do a mock-up, consider doing one with the same kind of fabric that you're going to use. I didn't know if I was going to be using a stretch fabric. Like I think in hindsight, I didn't think I'd be using a stretch fabric. So that's why I went with the fabrics that I did have for the mock-up. And just the nature of mock-ups, you're going to use fabrics that you just have lying around. So I don't really fault myself for that, but it's just kind of unfortunate that it didn't look great. I might take it apart and rework it. We'll see what happens. But that's the only thing that I really have a problem with this cosplay. Aside from that, I am absolutely in love with like the top half of the cosplay. I think it looks great. I love how I did my makeup. I feel really awesome about that. So yeah, so that's all really positive. The other thing I want to say is the sequins. The sequins were probably not a good idea because when they rub against each other, they get tangled. And so like the crotch area of this costume is already totally wrecked because of just like when you're walking and everything. So a bunch of the sequins have ripped off and gotten tangled and everything. So it's very messy down there. So maybe don't do sequins, or if you're gonna do sequins, don't put sequins near your legs. So like putting them on the cuffs of the bloomers and then putting them on the like V-cut of the bodysuit, not a good idea. Aside from those things, I'm very happy to be doing this cosplay, even though it's only been like, at this point, it's been like a week and a half since I watched the show. So, you know, hyperfixation brain is crazy, but we love it anyway. So yeah, anyway, those are my wrap-up thoughts on this cosplay. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I hope that this was helpful. I hope that this inspires you maybe to make your own. Or if not, I hope that it was just entertaining. So anyway, I will see you guys all next time. But until then, Panda Faces, please be sure to take care. Bye!